Hello students, welcome to RJ Academy, and I know it's your board here, but don't worry. RJ Academy is with you to guide you throughout the year and to teach you in the easiest way. So, nationalism. It's this massive, absolute powerhouse of a force that literally completely transformed the political and mental landscape of the world. And today, we're going to decode exactly how that happened.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Think of this as your strategic roadmap for mastering the absolute most testable concepts for your upcoming board exams. We're going to hit 4 main topics today: Soryu's utopian vision, the French Revolution, visualizing the nation, and finally, how nationalism turns to imperialism.
All right, Section 1, Soryu's utopian vision. We're going to kick things off with a pretty grand vision that perfectly sets up our very first major board exam topic. Honestly, it all starts with just one highly detailed image that basically predicted the future of Europe. Now, you're definitely going to want to lock these specific details into your memory, because they are absolute gold for those objective-type MCQ questions. Picture this. It's 1848, and a French artist named Frédéric Souriau prepares a series of 4 prints. He gave it this epic title, The Dream of Worldwide Democratic and Social Republics. And in this masterpiece, he visualized a world made up entirely of democratic nations. Pretty wild for the time, right?
So here's a highly screen-grabbable definition for you. Souriau's painting was a utopian vision of world peace and democracy. But what does that actually mean? Well, he pictured people of Europe and America, men and women of all ages, just marching together and paying homage to the Statue of Liberty. It was a really beautiful idea, but back then it was purely utopian, meaning it was just too perfect to actually be real in a world that was still totally dominated by kings.
And speaking of kings, definitely keep this next key term in mind. An absolutist government is basically one where a monarch has total, completely unchecked power, no restraints whatsoever. And in Souriau's painting, he literally painted the shattered remains of these absolutist institutions just lying broken on the ground in the foreground. It was his way of signaling, hey, the era of absolute monarchs, it's finally coming to an end.
Now, this breakdown is super important and is highly likely to pop up as a 3-mark short answer question on your exam. You've got to know what each element represents. So, the Statue of Liberty, she's holding the torch of enlightenment in one hand and the Charter of Rights of Man in the other. Those shattered crowns on the floor, that's the literal fall of absolutist monarchical institutions. And that massive marching procession shows people grouped as distinct united nations, with the USA and Switzerland actually leading the way, simply because they were already established nations at that time.
So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that the entire goal of this 19th century movement was to replace those old, shifting, multinational dynastic empires with unified nation-states. And a nation-state isn't just about drawing a border on a map. No, it's a state where the majority of citizens share a real sense of common identity, a shared history, and a shared struggle. That intense feeling of collective belonging, that had to be actively created.
Which brings us to Section 2. The French Revolution. Let's see how this idealistic nationalism was actually executed in the real world, specifically in France. Because, building a nation takes way more than just declaring you have a country. It requires forging a literal family out of your citizens.
I'd highly recommend taking a screenshot of these points right now, because outlining these measures is basically a guaranteed 5-mark board question. The French revolutionaries took some very deliberate, calculated steps to forge a collective identity. They brought in these powerful concepts like la patrie, the fatherland, and la citoyenne, the citizen, to really emphasize a united community with equal rights. They completely tossed out the old royal flag for a brand new French tricolor. They renamed the Estates General to the National Assembly, created uniform laws, abolished internal custom duties, adopted a standardized system of weights and measures, and even pushed French as the common language over local dialects. They really went all in.
All right, let's do a quick knowledge check.
What were 2 specific steps taken to create a French collective identity? Go ahead and pause the explainer right here, think of the answer to really test your active recall, and then hit play when you're ready.
Okay, if you remember the new tricolor flag or maybe the uniform laws, fantastic job. Those ideas were so powerful that French armies, led by figures like Napoleon, soon carried them across all of Europe. There's actually this famous quote, "When France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches cold," and it perfectly captures the era. These revolutionary ideas were literally contagious. As French armies marched into places like Holland, Belgium, and Italy, they brought that spark of nationalism with them, inspiring other populations to rise up against their own absolute monarchs.
Moving on to Section 3, visualizing the nation. Now, what's really fascinating here is how these newly formed nations gave themselves a visual identity.
I mean, it's one thing to say you have a country, right? But how do you make everyday people feel deeply emotionally connected to an abstract concept like a nation?
Well, the answer is allegory. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, artists started using female figures as allegories to represent their nations. So instead of just painting a boring map, they painted a person. This gave the abstract idea of a nation a concrete, relatable human face. It was a brilliant way to unify the public through shared visual symbols.
Now, this direct comparison between the allegories of France and Germany was an absolute staple exam topic that you definitely need to memorize. Over in France, you had Marianne. She represented liberty in the Republic, and she was decked out in symbols like the red cap, the tricolor, and the cockade. They literally erected her statues in public squares so everyone would constantly be reminded of their national unity. Germany, on the flip side, had Germania. She was visually very distinct, she wore a crown of oak leaves, she held a sword representing a readiness to fight, and she was shown with broken chains to symbolize being freed.
Time for another quick active recall check. In the allegory of Germania, what does that crown of oak leaves specifically symbolize? Pause the explainer for a second and see if you can remember.
Did you guess it? The crown of oak leaves stands for heroism. If you got that right, you are perfectly trained for that specific objective question. In German culture, the oak leaf was the ultimate symbol of heroism, which made Germania this incredibly powerful, heroic figure of national strength.
All right, almost to the finish line. Section 4, Nationalism turns to imperialism. Let's transition to our climax, where this really beautiful idea of nationalism morphed into a pretty dangerous competition. What started as this utopian dream of freedom and brotherhood, it eventually took a much darker turn. Basically, that idealistic nationalism lost its democratic character and turned into aggressive imperialism. And we see this perfectly illustrated in the Balkans. The Balkan region was this highly diverse area controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which was slowly crumbling. As romantic nationalism spread like wildfire, the various groups living there desperately wanted their own independent nation-states. But here's the catch. They became deeply jealous of each other and started engaging in these explosive power struggles for more territory. And then, to make things worse, the big European powers, like Russia, Germany, and England, jumped right into this massive rivalry, hoping to dominate the area for themselves.
Listen up, because this is a massive statement-based question for your exams. Nationalism, aligned with imperialism, led Europe to disaster in 1914. This exact power struggle in the Balkans, fueled by this toxic mix of nationalism and imperial greed, was the literal spark that ignited the devastation of the First World War. The very force that initially liberated people had tragically become the tool for their destruction.
And that brings us to a final provocative thought for this session. Considering the absolute disaster of 1914, did nationalism ultimately do more harm than good for the world? How should we view the legacy of nationalism today? I mean, it's this incredibly complex force that built modern democracies, but it also caused some of history's darkest moments. I really want you to think about that as you review this material.
All right, that is a wrap. Thank you so much for studying with RJ Academy today. Keep studying hard. You've totally got this. And remember that the notes of this chapter is in the description. Catch you next time.